It's the music, and being Cole Porter, that saddens me, but we must do so. Welcome everybody. It's so good to be back on the Friday. We missed last Friday because, as you know, on the Tuesday we had our Bloomsday event, which was a huge success. So many people tuned in for that. So many people listened in. So many people sent donations. I promise you, our actors did very nicely out of it, and they are deeply appreciative. So for everybody who did tune into Bloomsday and everybody who did donate, and I remember all the donations on that day went to the actors who were doing stupendous work. And if you were listening, you know just how tricky that text is and how wonderfully well they did it. So on their behalf, thank you all. And I promise you that next year, Bloomsday will be even bigger and even better. We are going to make that another regular feature of PICT's online activities. So today we have, you're not going to be listening to me for another hour. We have a guest speaker. We have I'm not going to say a guest lecturer because these are conversations. But our guest today is Kathleen Dixon Donnelly. Now, Kathleen, who is an authority on a period of social and artistic history that I find completely fascinating. And also fascinating, not simply from the art that came out of it, but from the fact that it was all about conversation and the salon culture. And you've heard me when I talk about Oscar Wilde, talking about the influence and effect that his mother's salon had on him. There is nothing quite like listening to intelligent and articulate conversation to tickle the imagination and get the creative juices flowing. It happened with Oscar Wilde, and it happened with several groups of people. Kathleen, as I say, is an authority on this. She gained her PhD actually in Dublin City University in Ireland. We have a connection there because my own company, Second Age, we used to present our productions in the theatre out there, which there you are. You see, you never know. 1 degree of separation all the time. She's recently retired from Birmingham City University in the UK. She's a published author, and you can get her book list actually on the website. We've already put it up there. But the particular topic that she's going to talk about today is, as I say, about a particular salon culture. Her fields of authority lead her to the Irish literary revival, to the Bloomsbury set, to the artistic circle in Paris around in the 1920s. But the most particular one, and the one for today, that we're thrilled she's going to talk about because it excites me and it is the most pertinent to the development of theatre in America, is she's going to talk about the Algonquin Circle, that group of remarkable people who gathered in the Algonquin Hotel to lunch, to talk, and possibly to imbibe in adult beverage occasionally. But more of that from Kathleen. Kathleen, welcome to PICT, welcome to the family, and it's over to you. Why is she not? Can she hear me? No. Yep. Kathleen, your volume is not on. We can't hear you. Just push the reconnect button and that may fix it. Push the reconnect. She's talking and we can't hear her.
Now, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Wonderful.
Okay. It was under settings for future for me.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Okay.
Okay.
Hello, me again. For those of you who don't know, all of my talks and research are under the title of Such Friends. And it comes from a line from William Butler Yeats' poem where he said, "And say my glory was I had such friends." And Lord knows Dorothy Parker had such friends. As Alan mentioned, the four groups of writers that I studied were Yeats and his friends who started the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, which maybe we'll talk about in the future, and the Bloomsbury Group, and my fellow Pittsburgher, Gertrude Stein, and the Americans in Paris, and then, of course, Dorothy Parker and the Algonquin Round Table. Now, in the invitation and the email to this event, you saw the famous Hirschfield drawing of the Algonquin Round Table, the cartoon, which gets reproduced quite a bit. And you can take a look at it there. Our lovely Catherine has put it up again. They just look like a lot of line drawings, but I think by the end of my talk, we'll put it up again and you should be able to recognize quite a few of them. The group itself, it started, no one's ever been able to find the exact date, but it was definitely in the summer of 1919. And I will say the hotel did all last summer, they did a centenary celebration. But so that was, of course, right after the Great War. And that was the first time that this group and the group that I define as the core group came together for lunch at the Algonquin. Now, one of the things I found in all four groups that we'll talk a little bit about today is that there were certain roles, certain characters who kind of popped up in all four. It was pretty consistent across all four groups. And the main one in every group was the star. And of course, in this group, that was Dorothy Parker with her feather boa. And this was the person who was kind of the magnet that sort of drew everyone together. Dottie, who was born Dorothy Rothschild, she was actually born in New Jersey. We think of her as such a New Yorker, which she was, but her family had a cottage at the shore. And she was born in August. They were there. A huge storm came through and her mother went into labor. So she was born in New Jersey. And because of that, she is in the New Jersey Hall of Fame, which I'm sure she's thrilled about. So she grew up in New York. Her mother died when she was 5. And 2 years later, her father remarried the evil stepmother. And the evil stepmother was a very religious person. She only lived 3 more years. So by the time she was 10, Dorothy had kind of 2 deaths under her belt, the way she saw it. But the religious stepmother sent her, even though Dorothy and her father were Jewish, the stepmother sent her to a convent school. And Parker always claimed that she was fired from the school for saying that the Immaculate Conception was actually spontaneous combustion. There's no proof of that, however. But that was the end of her formal education. So she never went to college, never went to university. When she was 20, her father died. Now, they had never been particularly close. And by that time, she was living on her own in Manhattan. She was working as a piano teacher at a dancing school. And she was, as many people at the time were doing, she was sending out to the newspapers and magazines poems and little short quips and jokes and things like that, and getting some of them published in local papers. She got a poem published in Vanity Fair, and she was over the moon. She got paid $12 and figured this was it. She'd hit her height. And she stayed in touch with the editor there, Frank Crowninshield, with Vanity Fair. And eventually he hired her for Vogue, the other Condé Nast magazine that he was in charge of. So she went to work for Vogue, wasn't particularly comfortable there. She also met and married the first in a long line of handsome, blonde, not particularly bright, rich men named Edwin Pond Parker III. She had a tendency for men that had numbers after their names. And Eddie, and she got married in 1917, just as America went to war. So they got married and Eddie was off. He enlisted and he was off to Europe. And so it was one of those kind of marriages. So if we look at where she was in the summer of 1919, when the first luncheon was held, she had been at Vogue and she wasn't real happy there. and Crowninshield had the good sense to move her over to Vanity Fair. So by now she was writing for Vanity Fair. She was a drama critic there. She was doing great. You know, this was the perfect life. Now every star had to have a host or a hostess, somebody to take care of them. Gertrude Stein had Alice, you know. Dorothy Parker had her best friend, Robert Benchley. And Robert Benchley, you'll find him in there. There we go. We're catching up. There he is, Bench. He was actually a lot of people's best friend. He was very sweet and very reliable. And he was the one she would call upon whenever she committed suicide or tried. Benchley was from Massachusetts, around Boston, and typical middle class kind of family. And when he was 9 years old, he had a brother who was much older, who was killed in the Spanish-American War in Cuba. And when the messenger came, you know, they would send a telegram to tell you that your loved one had died. It was the family party was going on, and his mother got the telegram, and as soon as she read it, she said, "Oh my God, how come it couldn't have been Robert?" This is not considered great parenting, and she did regret it right away, but it kind of cast a pall on his life. But his brother also had a fiancée, claimed to be his fiancée, named Lillian. And Lillian took a liking to younger Robert and came from a well-to-do family. So she paid for Benchley, Robert Benchley, to go to Exeter and also helped finance when he went to Harvard. So he did go to Harvard for the full 4 years. And as you may have guessed, he was on the Harvard Lampoon and he was part of the Hasty Pudding theatricals, just exactly what you would expect of a humorist at Harvard. But in addition, he actually, even while he was in college, got a really big reputation in Boston as an after-dinner speaker because he would tell all these great stories and great jokes. He was quite good at it at the time. And he had met, when he was in grade school, a lovely young lady named Gertrude Darling, and he married her, and they had 2 children, and he was exempt from going to the war because he had a wife and kids. And he was, after he got out of Harvard, actually, he was sick towards the end of his career. He had some kind of minor illness, and he couldn't take his exams. So he had to do his exams later, and they mailed them to him. And one of the exams, this is one of those stories that could be apocryphal, but one of the exams had, the question had to do with the British maritime fishery law. And he wrote the essay answering that question from the point of view of the fish. So he kind of started on his career at this point. And he was also sending things into New York newspapers and magazines. And he got the attention of Frank Crowninshield as well. And when he came down to New York, eventually he moved his whole family to New York, Crownie, as he was known, hired Benchley at Vanity Fair, but as managing editor. He was very young. You know, these people were all so young. They were all in their 20s. They grew up with the century, so they were in their 20s. So he was in the summer of 1919, he was at Vanity Fair. He and Dorothy Parker hit it off right away and became basically lifelong friends with a few interruptions in there. Now, every group, think of your own group of friends. There's usually an irritant, somebody who's like the sand in the oyster that just gets under everybody's skin. And if you don't know who it is, then it's probably you. This is the person who people say, "Oh, you're in that group. You must know so-and-so," and everybody's eyes roll back in their heads. Well, in this group, Alexander Woollcott, next one up, he was really irritating. You can see just by the looks of him. Here's my explanation of how irritating Alexander Woollcott was. He was so irritating that his friends, including our Pittsburgher, George S. Kaufman, they wrote a play about how irritating he was called The Man Who Came to Dinner. And that's not enough. He was so irritating. He was thrilled that they'd written a play about him, and he played the lead. So he played this irritating self. That was our Alex. He was a real interesting character. He grew up in a commune in New Jersey. He did have formal education also. He went to Hamilton College, and then through family connections, he got a job at the New York Times. So he was a reporter for the New York Times. And when the war broke out, he enlisted. He was very proud of enlisting for his country and going to war, and was sent to Europe. But when he was stationed in France, he heard that the US Army was starting a newspaper in Paris by enlisted men for enlisted men. And so he took off for Paris right away and got a job on being a reporter. That was how he spent his war, on the Stars and Stripes. And actually, he covered a lot of the war. He did a lot of good reporting there. And in the summer of 1919, war was over, he had come back to New York, back to his job at the New York Times. And there was a very enterprising PR guy. I love when public relations people show up in the old days, because I used to be one. And this PR guy wanted to get some publicity for his new client, a very young, unknown playwright named Eugene O'Neill, and no one had heard of him. So the PR guy figured, you know, if I invite all the drama critics and media people in Manhattan to lunch at the Algonquin, they're not going to come to meet Eugene O'Neill because no one knows who he is. But I'll bet they'll come if we're welcoming Alex Woollcott back from the war, because everybody knew Alex Woollcott. So he sent invitations to people in the media, including Dorothy Parker. And she said, I'm coming, but I'm bringing my buddy from Vanity Fair, Robert Benchley. And so they came to the first luncheon, and some of the others, a lot of the others we're going to talk about kind of drifted in later. And as they were leaving the lunch, somebody said, nobody remembers who, why don't we do this every day? And they pretty much did for the next just about 9 years, the way I have it timed. Now, every group, think of your group of friends, there's this irritating person, but part of the group didn't kick him out. He's entertaining, have the irritating person, but they're usually balanced off with someone who's a little calmer, a little nicer, the angel, as I call it. And the angel in this group was the first of our fellow Western Pennsylvanians, Mark Connolly. There he is. He was from McKeesport, actually, and his family was a very theatrical family. They were in vaudeville and they traveled around a lot. And when his mother was pregnant, they figured maybe it's time to settle down. And so they bought a hotel in McKeesport called the White Hotel. I've never been to McKeesport, but in case anybody there knows it. And it became kind of a theatrical hotel. A lot of performers and things would stay there. So this is how Mark Connolly kind of grew up in a theatrical atmosphere. When he was about 7, they brought him to Pittsburgh to see a play, and he was over the moon. He just thought this was great. He felt like it was like going to church. And from that time on, he started writing plays. He started producing little plays for the family. When he was 17, he got a job on one of the Pittsburgh newspapers. There's conflicting reports of which one. There were a lot of Pittsburgh newspapers in those days. And not only did he work as a reporter, for those of you who might be familiar with this, he was also a stage manager for plays at the PAA, the Pittsburgh Athletic Association, which I'm assuming at the time would have been in that same building that it was in up till recently in the middle of Oakland. So he worked on some plays. He wrote some lyrics for a play that was going to be put on Broadway. So he figured it's a great chance, I'll go to New York. And the play was a total flop, but he decided, why go back to Pittsburgh? So he stayed in New York at that point. He did some PR work. A lot of these guys tried PR. They were terrible at it. He forgot to send out a notice that the play was opening. So he didn't last long in that, but he was, you know, doing some writing and working in the theater. So in the summer of 1919, he was part of that group as well, and eventually started coming to the Algonquin for lunch. Now, also in every group, I found there was one guy who wasn't very funny and didn't really tell good stories and was kind of flat, you know, and you think, why is he in this group of all these funny, interesting people? Not just in the Algonquins, but every group had somebody like this. And I thought, good academic researcher, what do they have in common? Turns out what they had in common was each one of those guys got the money. They either had the money or they got the money. And in the case of the Algonquin Roundtable, it was Harold Ross. And Harold Ross, there you'll see him. Harold Ross was the least New Yorker-ish New Yorker ever. He was born in Colorado. He came from a silver mining background. He had been a journalist, a traveling journalist. He worked on papers in San Francisco and Atlanta, and he finally ended up working in New York. And he enlisted when war broke out and when America entered the war. And he went to Paris and he was made editor of Stars and Stripes. And Harold Ross had a unique talent for being an editor. It wasn't, he could write, but it's a different kind of talent when you're kind of choosing articles, working with writers. He was great at it. And so he was the editor of Stars and Stripes in Paris. While he was there, he met a woman who was the correspondent for the New York Times named Jane Grant. She was entertaining the troops. We'll leave it at that. And they met there. And so after the war ended, they came back to New York and they too were invited to come to the Algonquin Hotel for lunch. Now we finally get to our other fellow Western Pennsylvanian, our Pittsburgher, George S. Kaufman. And George S. Kaufman, you'll see his picture in a minute. There he is, great hair, didn't he? He was born in Pittsburgh, as near as I can find out, in Shadyside, grew up on Kentucky Avenue. And his role in the group, the observer, there was always someone who was in the group, but just a little bit outside, and was also members of other groups. He was a member of a lot of different clubs and organizations. But when you read descriptions of the people, there's always somebody who's kind of sitting sort of in the background watching it all go by, and that was Kaufman. From what I can tell, now there may be Kaufman freaks out there who know better than I do, but he went to Liberty School, which is in Shadyside, and his family was at Rodeph Shalom Temple. And his uncle was one of the founders of the Concordia Club, and I'm not sure if that's still around. And he was a big Pirates fan, by the way. No Steelers then, so Pirates fan. His father was in manufacturing, and for a while they lived in Newcastle, and then they also lived in New Jersey and whatever. But when the family was living in New Jersey, when he was a bit older, he also went to Pitt Law School just for a year. That was enough. They were living in New Jersey, and he would go over to New York. He was sending things out to these columns, trying to get things published. At one point, he was a manager of a small theater outside of New York City, and that didn't go very well. And after one production, he sent a telegram to his family that said, the Last Supper with original cast would not draw in this theater. And so after that, he kind of confined himself to New York City, where he would send things out to the newspapers and the magazines, and got some published. He also, one night, he was at a play, and he heard somebody laughing quite loudly, and turned and looked, and here it was Mark Connolly, and that's how they met. He said he was the most distinguished man in the room. He distinguished himself by laughing louder than all the others. And of course, they initially hit it off and realized they were both from Western Pennsylvania and became good friends and started collaborating on plays together. And Kaufman almost always collaborated. He only wrote one play on his own. He always had a collaborator. In the beginning, it was Mark Connolly. Now, you're wondering, who were they sending these quips to? Well, they were sending them mostly to the top columnist in Manhattan of the time. Everybody got up in New York, got up in the morning, got their newspaper, and was reading FPA, which stands for, you'll see his picture in a minute. Thank you, Catherine. Which stands for Franklin Pierce Adams. And he was actually another quintessential New Yorker. He was from Chicago, but had been in New York for a long time. He had a column on the Evening Mail, and then it was moved over to the Tribune. And Dorothy Parker said he raised her from a couplet because she was always sending things, and he would print them. And Kaufman, he took a particular liking to. He was best man at Kaufman's wedding, and he got Kaufman full-time real jobs on newspapers. And by the summer of 1919, Kaufman was on the New York Times and actually working with Woolcott because he was like an assistant drama critic. So obviously he came to lunch, and FPA was invited to lunch as well. And then we have one last character. Now, if you read things about the Round Table, a lot of other people have all these kind of characters, but I narrow it down to these 8. And the last one, role in the group, FPA, was the link because he was already established. Okay, he had a real job. So he was their link to mainstream media. Remember, these were all young people starting out. Haywood Broun, and I did get his name right, Haywood Broun was what I call the bridge, because every group had somebody from a different field. So if you think about it, why was John Maynard Keynes, the economist, hanging out with all these writers like Virginia Woolf? He was the bridge to another field. It brings a different perspective, a different point of view. And I maintain that's what makes these groups so creative. So this is an argument for diversity. I'll just mention that. Haywood Broun was the father of Haywood Hale Broun. So some of you were thinking of him. He was the great guy on CBS who used to do those sports reports in the colorful jackets. But Haywood Broun, his jackets, he always looked like an unmade bed. He was just a mess. And he was from Massachusetts. He actually came from quite a posh family, also went to Harvard, just like Benchley did, and came to New York and was a sports writer. So he was a writer, and Keynes was a writer as well. Broun was a writer, but he was very political. And he was more political than the rest of them at that time, and got them involved in political events, as we'll see. And he also, what he's known for now is that he was the founder of the Newspaper Guild, so one of the first unions for newspaper people. So here we have the summer of 1919. The war is over, thank God, everybody's thrilled. And these people start going to lunch on a regular basis. All of them weren't there every day, but they would know that around lunchtime, you could stop by the Algonquin and there'd probably be somebody there. Now, they got to be quite well known, and particularly because FPA was mentioning them. Oh, I was off with Miss Dorothy Parker last night to the theater. And so people would come to the hotel to see them. And Frank Case, who was the owner of the hotel, he was very smart, and he moved the round table right into the center. And for those of you who have been there, there's a wonderful lobby. Definitely have a drink at the Algonquin lobby. It's fabulous. And then when you get into the dining room, the round table is right in the center. And he started to give them free starters because despite all their work, they never had any money, really, not at this point. And so they became to be really well known. Now, the way the decade started for them, however, in 1920, Dorothy Parker at Vanity Fair had asked for a raise. And in the beginning of the year, in January, and just as an insert, I'm doing a blog about what was happening 100 years ago. And this was one of the first ones I wrote. So January of 1920, Frank Crowninshield invited her for tea at the plaza. And she thought, this is great, I'm getting a raise. And he fired her. And so she ordered the biggest dessert on the menu and then went home to Eddie. The husband was back from the war, and Eddie wasn't doing very well. He had become addicted to morphine and alcohol. And so she called her best friend, Robert Benchley, who was it was a Sunday, he was up in Scarsdale with the wife and kids in the suburbs. And he came right into town on the train because I think he was looking for any excuse to get away from the wife and the kids in Scarsdale. And the next morning, when he went into work, he wrote his resignation. And he said to Crowninshield, this job is not good enough for me without my friends, Dorothy Parker, and there was another guy working at the magazine who was also fired. So Parker and Benchley now are freelancers. And actually, they did quite well. And they rented an office together, good idea to do when you're freelancing, not far away, right in Midtown. And one or the other or both of them described it as 1 cubic foot less, and it would be adultery. So the two of them had desks pointed at each other, and they would sit there and work. And Dottie started getting lots of freelance stuff. She was doing articles for the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's, all kinds of magazines. Woolcott and FPA kept mentioning them in their columns, so they were keeping them really visible. Eventually, because he had a family to support, he did shortly take a real full-time job at Life magazine. It wasn't the Life magazine that we knew. It was a humor magazine at the time, and he was made managing editor there. But he was also doing some freelancing. So they were doing, quite well for being on their own in New York. Connolly and Kaufman started writing together, and one of their first plays was called Dulcie, and it was based on a character that FPA had created in his column, and it was Lynn Fontanne who actually played Dulcie, and that was a hit. Now, they wrote a lot of plays together, but they did write a play called West of Pittsburgh. Go figure, didn't do great in New York, but they did bring it back, they revised it, and brought it back as a play called The Deep Tangled Wildwood, whatever. So I think that was the only time they really did anything about Pittsburgh. And I don't think they came back here very often unless one of their plays was trying out here. In 1922, as you do when you're hanging out with your incredibly creative and talented friends, and everybody's had a few drinks. And remember, it was Prohibition, and they were drinking like fish. They used to bring flasks of it with them into the Algonquin. But in 1922, they were all sitting around and somebody said, why don't we put on a show? Of course. And they did for one night. It was called No Siree. And it was a parody. It was like a variety show. And it was a parody of a current review that was on Broadway from France. And there's programs from this. There's really not many actual scripts of what went on. If you do get a chance to see the film, which I put on the reading list, Mrs. Parker and the Vicious Circle, they do recreate this show in some scenes, and it's very funny. But the main thing, and Jascha Heifetz played the violin, and they all took part different things. Parker wrote some things, wasn't on stage. But the main thing that came out of that show was that Benchley, of course, was asked to contribute. And he claims he wrote this whole piece in the taxi on the way over. And it was called The Treasurer's Report. And it was quite funny. And he plays a treasurer who has to give, he plays a guy who has to give a report for the treasurer to some small organization that he belongs to. But it's quite in his style, and it is very funny, and it was a big hit. And so the very next day, this only ran for one day, and it was an invited audience. They just invited their friends, so they got lots of laughs. The very next day, Irving Berlin, who was putting on the Music Box Review, a lot of reviews in Broadway, he said to Benchley, I want you to do that bit, the Treasurer's Report, in my Music Box Review every night. And Benchley said, every night? Are you kidding me? My knees hurt. No, you'd have to pay me $500 a week. And Irving Berlin said, it's a deal. So Benchley was then doing this in addition to his full-time job. And so he had to stay in New York City, couldn't make it home to Scarsdale. Poor Gertrude sitting there with the two kids. Around about this time, these people were always socializing together. It was Cole Porter who said, don't they ever see anybody else? It's always them together. They'd be seen all over in the speakeasies. Another playwright moved to New York from Chicago named Charles MacArthur. And let's put it this way. One of their friends gave him a stamp that said, I love you. He was not the most reliable of those. He was married at the time, but Dorothy Parker really fell for him, and he really broke her heart. And she got pregnant, and she had to have an abortion. As she said, it serves me right for putting all my eggs in one bastard. He also became friends with Benchley. Everybody became friends with Benchley. They shared an apartment together. Benchley was her best friend. In order to hang out with him, she had to hang out with the guy who broke her heart. So poor Dottie, Part of this is the reason she had about 3 suicide attempts in the 1920s. One with razors and with a razor, and 2 with pills. Benchley came to her in the hospital. He was the host, always taking care of her. And he said, Dottie, you got to quit this or you're going to hurt yourself. The whole group was also spending time out in Long Island at Herbert Baird Swope's mansion and parties, and Scott and Zelda's parties. It was a fun time, I have to say. Right in the middle, 1925, Harold Ross, the sponsor, managed to finally get the money to start the magazine that he and Jane Grant wanted to start, called The New Yorker. And he listed all of his friends as an advisory board. He said it was the biggest lie I ever told. None of them had agreed to it. He just put their names in there. He got the money, and some of you may know this, of how The New Yorker was funded. He got the money from a rich guy who Alexander Woollcott had introduced to him, Raoul Fleischman of Fleischman's Yeast. He knew nothing about publishing or magazines or whatever, but he had a whole lot of money, and Ross got it out of him. So he invested in The New Yorker. I haven't really seen them, but the first few issues are pretty bad. But Dorothy was writing for them. He wasn't paying much at all. He never did pay very much. Around about May of 1925, just a few months after it started, they decided to shut it down. It was just throwing good money after bad. But Fleischman and Ross and everybody else, they went out to Connecticut for FPA's wedding. He was getting married for the second time. And at the wedding, having a few drinks, Fleischman said, oh, I'll put some more money in it. Let's keep it going a few more months. And as we know, The New Yorker, now this is a reproduction of the first cover, February 1925, Eustace Tilley on the cover. As we know, it's still going strong. They even have their own radio hour. Kaufman and Connolly just kind of drifted apart. They never really had a big fight or a breakup. Kaufman wrote one play on his own called The Butter and Egg Man, but he did collaborate then with Edna Ferber. He directed Coconuts with the Marx Brothers on Broadway. Haywood Broun absolutely loved Coconuts. He saw it 21 times. I know they're funny, but you know. And got into some directing. As we know, he went on to work with Moss Hart and won a few Pulitzers on his own. So he did pretty well. Parker did pretty well too, although she was always complaining, never had any money, blah, 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 blah. Her poetry was collected in book form, and she had bestsellers. Now, poetry books are not bestsellers even now. And in the 20s, they weren't either. The first one was called Enough Rope. After that, there was Laments for the Living, Death and Taxes, Sunset Gun. Do we see a pattern here? But she actually did quite well. And she kind of had a string of her male bimbos that she dated. Eddie and she finally did get divorced towards the end of the 20s. And so she still always went though by Mrs. Parker. She said she got married to change her name. In 1927, the major topic of conversation in the whole country was the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, which some of you may be familiar with. And I put the original robbery that Sacco and Vanzetti were accused of in my blog, and nobody got the connection to the literary 1920s. Well, Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants in Boston who were falsely accused of major robbery and murder. And it was felt that they were accused and convicted because they were Italian immigrants, and they were also anarchists, and they were anarchists. They admitted to that, but they didn't admit to the murders. And they were sentenced to death. And this caused quite an uproar. Broun was a big supporter of Sacco and Vanzetti, and in fact, he wrote a column about it, and the paper he was on didn't agree, and he lost his job. He managed to politicize a lot of the rest of the group, although Wolcott said, oh, they were probably guilty. You're not helping, Alex. And so a lot of them went to Boston to protest march, including Dorothy Parker. And there's a good photo that's circulating around on the internet of her and John Dos Passos marching with placards and don't kill them. They were all arrested, and eventually the charges were lessened. And Dorothy Parker, probably, she was thrilled, was charged with loitering and sauntering and had to pay a $5 fine. So she did. But this was the beginning of when the group got to be a bit more political. Towards the end of the 1920s, 1928, one thing which we have to mention here, but I have to say for us Western Pennsylvanians, it's a bit embarrassing. Mark Connolly had his big hit play called Green Pastures. If any of you know anything about it, it's embarrassing. It's based on Negro spirituals and stories, which of course he felt as an Irish American, he could do a much better job of. Did have an all black cast. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and the film was also nominated for awards. I don't think you're ever going to see this film on television, and certainly not in the next few years. We can only hope. I remember seeing parts of it once. It's really embarrassing. Also in 1928, here was Hollywood. Hollywood needed content. Where was the content? The content was in New York. And so everybody started being invited to come out to Hollywood and write. By the end of 1928, the way I define the end of a group is that one of the key people moves away. And in this case, it was Benchley, who he didn't move to Hollywood, but he was spending a lot more time out there. He was invited out there to film The Treasurer's Report. And he also filmed a lot of other shorts, which are on YouTube, and they're very funny. The Sex Life of the Polyp was one of them. Parker had been out there, but she was mostly back in New York. So when you have him gone, you know, so to me, the group kind of fades away then. Although Edna Ferber, who is in that drawing of the round table, I didn't include her in my core group though, but she claims it was 1932 when she was shopping and it was lunchtime and she thought, oh, I'll stop by the Algonquin to use at lunch, plopped herself down on the round table and was looking directly into the faces of a family from Kansas. And she thought, it's over. So somewhere in there it ended. Right after it ended, and this is another pattern with the other groups, Dorothy Parker won the O. Henry Prize for her short story, which is called Big Blonde. And if you only read one Dorothy Parker story, I would highly recommend it. It's a real heartbreaker. And she got it published in the Bookman, prestigious magazine, because she was sleeping with the editor. So good for Dottie. So that's where we come to the end of the group. And I believe at this point, Alan is going to have some questions for me.
That's wonderful. You paint such a glorious picture of salon life. And we tend to, when we read about these things, and the academic tomes that are produced about all these people in these groups, they do tend to sort of paint the picture of literary gods and intellectual geniuses. But what you're giving us is a wonderful picture of these very human beings.
They were.
And also the fact that wit comes out of actuality. It's not something that's invented out of the air. Which a couple of points you made. For instance, the Alexander Woollcott being possibly one of the most unpleasant people that you could wish to meet.
Yeah.
Being brilliantly satirized in the character of Sheridan Whiteside in The Man Who Came to Dinner, and then playing it himself.
Yes.
Is such a glorious thing. I actually, the side dish, one of the things I love about that play and that character, he's got one of the best opening lines of any character in any play. When all gone out and then they bring him back in and everybody's running around and fussing and there's noise and mayhem and chaos, and he's come back in and he can't walk and he's there, and suddenly there's this moment of silence when they all look at him, and his line is glorious. I may vomit. And it's one of the best opening lines of any character ever. The other point about that was because Monty Woolley played it in the movie.
Yes.
And Monty Woolley goes down in cinema history as playing the most unpleasant character and the most pleasant character, because not only did he play Sheridan Whiteside, but he also played Santa Claus. So
right.
He really, the whole spectrum of appalling
extreme
glory. Let's talk a little bit about the just the salon culture, because what you paint is this wonderful group of remarkably gifted and articulate people, the capacity to talk. And I always say the capacity to talk is not dependent on a massive intellect. It's dependent on a massive imagination with vocabulary. But do you see that very strict parallel happening in the other three groups that you mentioned? If you compare that, say, to the Irish literary, because you've got W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory and George Martin and that whole group, was that same degree of obviously intellect, but of fun, of just excited by the ideas, or was that very specific to the other?
I think they all were fun in their own way. They were very kind of cliquish. Dorothy Parker could be a real bitch behind people's back, even people in the group. Virginia Woolf was apparently actually quite funny, with her group of friends. And the Irish, of course, they're always funny. And in Paris, Gertrude Stein, I don't know, she was kind of a little more sardonic, and kind of tended to take things a little more seriously. But a lot of times with the group too, what they would do is to read out things they were working on. So, there would be input from others in the group. I know with the Algonquin Roundtable, because remember, the things they were saying were getting published the next day in the paper, unlike the Bloomsburys. And they would come to lunch having already worked out lines to say. Haywood Hale Broun knew. He was a little kid under the table, and he said they would come with stuff written out. They had worked on them.
Well, they weren't unique in that, though, were they? I mean, it was the old classic thing. My particular field of worship, Oscar Wilde. The old thing that Oscar, the story. He would go to an art exhibition the evening before it opened, so he could work out all the witty things he would say when he went back for the opening. A lot of people, a lot of professional wits will do that. But I think that's quite delightful. I think
the writing and the rewriting. Well, even something like one of her famous lines is, use the word horticulture in a sentence. Who says that at lunch? Nobody, But her answer was, you can lead a whore to culture, but you can't make her.
Absolutely, it's
That's
brilliant.
a perfect line, but you know that,
That's been worked on. That
was
one's been worked on. Yeah, but it's brilliant nonetheless. I mean,
yeah,
it's
very good.
one of the true. I just got a thing here from one of our regulars, Dennis. I remember an instructor telling me that Parker walked into the Vanity Fair office, found a desk, started writing captions until eventually a pay envelope appeared with her name on it.
Well, she was officially hired. She was definitely hired. She had an interview and she was hired.
It's a
But
great
she
story.
did write captions. Brevity is the soul of lingerie. And one of the ones, well, that was at Vogue, actually. And one of the ones that got her in trouble at Vogue was she said there was a little girl, had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. And when she was good, she was very, very good. And when she was bad, she wore this lovely Michelin soie lingerie. And, Vogue magazine never admitted that their readers ever had sex. So that was not quite what they were looking for. So they switched her over to Vanity Fair.
Yeah, Vanity Fair was much more likely to accept the notion that sex would occur at some point.
Yeah, somewhere.
Yeah. But her witticisms were. I'm just intrigued by the idea because this salon notion, and as I say, I've talked a lot about the effect on Oscar Wilde of his mother's salons because hers were of the intelligentsia of Dublin. I mean, the Merrion Square was the home of the great and the good, quite literally. Ireland by that stage was a meritocracy more than an aristocracy. So they all came there, and to listen to those conversations, I think when I don't want to use the word intellectual, but I think the words when people of imagination and vocabulary get together, ideas start to generate, and this is a perfect example because. I mean, you've mentioned, or we've talked about before, that are your speciality. But if you look back in literature, the Brontes ran a literary salon, their father's dining room. Those girls and their brother sat down at a table and talked about what they were writing and what they were thinking. That was basically a literary salon because it was the exchange of ideas, wasn't it?
Well, the history of the salons, which I've only really delved into a little bit, but they were usually hosted by women. And a lot of them, they trace them back particularly to 18th century France. And the thing was, women like Lady Gregory weren't allowed to go out to bars or pubs.
No.
Gertrude Stein could have, but she didn't want to. That was too much competition, So they would invite people to their house. And Lady Gregory invited everybody to Coole Park, and Virginia and her sister Vanessa, they each invited people to their houses, and Gertrude invited certain people to hers. But at the same time as the Algonquin Round Table, there was a really fascinating woman named Mabel Dodge Lewin, and she had a salon downtown in Greenwich Village, but that salon was more political. So different salons would kind of have different personalities. And the Round Table was known for wit and for being theater people and writing people. But there were also, and usually concurrently, and I even think Speranza, his mother, I think hers was a little more political. But like you said, the intelligentsia of Dublin. So there was, and in Dublin, Yeats actually hosted a salon at his place. He lived there, and George Moore. So there were different nights. Thursday we're going here.
I know that when the founders of the Gate, my mentor Hilton Edwards and his partner Michael McLearmore, when they first got the Gate Theatre moving, their house became a salon, and the great and the good would go there, sometimes for conversation and sometimes for relaxation. But that same principle seemed to apply. That do you think that's still happening now? Do you think?
That's an interesting question, because when I was doing this as academic research, my original plan was to find a group of young people now who were doing kind of the same thing. And we have to remember, all of these groups, they really, the Round Table was kind of famous for being witty, but they really weren't as well known when they were in this group. This was kind of like their sophomore year, they were working it out. Virginia Woolf published her first novel as soon as the group broke up. And so it's kind of hard to identify people who aren't famous yet. But I did meet with a lovely young group of artists and writers in the Village in New York, because my friend, her son, was in it, and he's now working for American Art Magazine, I think. And my idea was to trace them, but somehow they've all dispersed. Who knows? So it's kind of hard to pinpoint. I think now maybe it happens more at university. Like I remember in my dorm, we would all hang out in somebody's room and things like that.
Well, there's Dublin. There's a theatre company in Dublin called Rough Magic, and Rough Magic started out as a group in University College Dublin, just doing plays together, talking together, working together. They just carried on when they left university. It's now one of the most established theatre companies in Ireland. Lynn Parker is a remarkable woman, and the alumni of that include, for those who've ever watched Father Ted, Pauline McGlynn, who played, she was one of that early group. So I think the point you make is right, that they're probably there, but they haven't become famous yet.
Yeah, so we don't know.
And by the time they do become famous, they'll already have parted company.
They will have kind of moved on, and they move on to other groups oftentimes. But they're
because it's like a virus, isn't it? It just it keeps hopping. Another comment here. Helen Hayes, she was afraid to go to the ladies' room for fear of what Parker would say about her while she was gone.
I'm not surprised. Yes, and she married Charles MacArthur.
That's right.
Yeah, and she's written quite a few interesting things about the time period.
Well,
now, you mentioned going to the ladies' room.
Oh, yes. Tell us about the ladies' room. Yes, tell us about the ladies' room.
Here's my example that I used to tell my students of the importance of primary research, actually going to see something. All of life is not on the internet. And so I went to the Algonquin Hotel, and actually I stayed there one night. It was great. I went to see a play, whatever. But I noticed, and when I was back just a year or two ago, it was the same. The ladies' room is down a spiral staircase that you go down from the lobby of the hotel, down this little spiral staircase, and the ladies' room's at the bottom. And when I came up, I said, there's a concierge, and they do have things you can buy there. I got a Snowy, and there's the Algonquin cat. So they're very good at merch. They've got their merch. But I said to the guy, I said, that would have been like that in the 1920s. I mean, it's been renovated, but that was there. And he said, yes. And I said, so she was drunk at lunch wearing little kitten heels going down those steps. And he said, yes. And did you notice when you get to the bottom, there's a disabled stall in the ladies' room? Now, I had a hard enough time getting down those steps. I don't know how a disabled person would get down those steps. I think I took pictures. There they are. There's the steps that she used to go down. And I think there's a second picture of the disabled stall. But he said it was the law. We had to, when we renovated, we had to put in disabled facilities. So God bless Dorothy. And they were drunk at lunch, and they really were serious drinkers. I mean, they're very funny, and it's funny to talk about, but they were serious alcoholics.
They were serious drinkers, and she would have had to do that drunk and in high heels.
Yes. Not backwards, but yes, drunk and in high heels. I know, God bless her. I have no record of her ever falling down the steps, but
wait a minute. There's a quote here. Is this one true? I love these quotes.
Yes.
It was it Robert Bletchley who was sent to Venice and on arrival cabled his editor, "Arrived Venice, streets flooded, please advise."
Yes, I definitely think that was him.
I have
to say, one of my favorite Dorothy Parker quotes that I bring out every New Year's, but it was like 1929. She was in Switzerland with this family that had a sick kid. She was absolutely miserable. And she cabled Robert Benchley and said, you get over here right now and explain why they're having another year. I think we're all going to say that this New Year's Eve. Do we have to do this again?
I love it.
Yeah. They use cables and telegrams quite efficiently, I think.
Oh, yeah. Well, the telegram is, in fact, a brilliant way to be witty. Because of brevity. I got a question here, and it does lead on to another point you want to get to. Many of the roundtable participants died young.
Yes.
In their 50s and 60s. Was that the time? Was that medicine? Was that what? You know? Do you want to talk about their end?
Yes, you want me? I'll kind of go through. It's true, and I want to say one of the things I found from doing this research of this time period, you know, the good old days. Well, in the good old days, no one talked about alcoholism, and no one talked about men who had depression, which I think Benchley did, and Sherwood Anderson and others. And gambling was not considered an addiction, even when Haywood Broun lost his apartment because he bet it in a gambling game. And so a lot of the things that now we look at as issues to be dealt with were just kind of, and the drinking, you know, was like that. And this is why, and I'll go through here. If we look at, I can just briefly,
We got
what happened to them, and then what happened to her.
Oh.
Yes, Haywood Broun, the bridge, 51 when he died. And in that case, it was mostly alcoholism. He had divorced Ruth Hale. I don't think he remarried, but she did. And she kept her maiden name, by the way, remember, Ruth Hale. FPA lasted a long time. Now, he was a drinker. I don't know if he was quite so heavy. He was definitely a heavy gambler. But FPA lasted till he was 78. He died in 1961, and some oldies may remember he was on a radio show, Information Please, and that I think then became a TV show as well. But he was just hanging around the New Yorker proofreading or something. You know, his glory days were in the 20s. Our own George S. Kaufman lasted till he was 71. He died in 1961. He got quite a few Pulitzer Prizes. Good for you, George. And actually, towards the end, he was kind of losing it. He was found wandering Park Avenue in a robe and slippers. So didn't do so well there towards the end. Harold Ross died at age 59. He was pretty much a drinker, but he died of cancer. He was editor of the magazine right up until the end, and then it was William Shawn who took over. He divorced Jane Grant, but she got a big chunk of New Yorker stock because she really was one of the founders of the magazine, and she remarried. Connolly, our fellow Western Pennsylvanian, lived to be 90, died in 1980. And here's my hot tip. If you have a group of friends who are well-known, or they're going to be well-known, the best thing you can do is outlive them. Because what I found is whoever was the last one to die in the group, they're always treated very well in the biographies, because all the biographers have to go to them and interview them. So Mark Connolly was such a nice guy. He was delightful. Duncan Grant, what a sweet old man. Who knows? But they kind of got a good reputation compared to a lot of the rest. Wolcott, 56 years old when he died. Not a surprise for someone who said, everything I do is either immoral, illegal, or fattening. In that Hirschfield drawing, that's the smallest he ever was as an adult. He just kept getting bigger. But here's the thing about Wolcott. After he was still reporter, critic, very well known, really famous for the time, and got a lot of gigs on radio. He was on radio a lot. He had a series called The Town Crier. And in 1943, he was getting ready to go on. There was like a panel show that was going to be talking about Hitler, one of the hot topics of the day. And just before they went, on, he passed a note to the person next to him and said, I feel sick, passed out, taken to the hospital, dead. Now, this is as close as you can get to dying on stage, and in fact, sometimes you'll hear the story that he died on air, but he managed to be whisked away before he died. Benchley, also 56. And he died in 1945. And most of the earlier biographies say that he got a severe nosebleed and hemorrhaged. But in reality, it was cirrhosis of the liver that brought it on. And he was in New York. Parker was in Hollywood by then. They hadn't been talking that much because she got very political in Hollywood, and he just didn't want anything to do with it at all. So they hadn't really been friends. I'm thrilled to say that one of the stories my mother told me turns out to be true. Robert Benchley was cremated, and according to his wishes, his ashes were put in a leather briefcase, and his wife and children rode to the funeral home with the briefcase on the seat in the taxi next to him. My mother told me this. I thought, she's got to be kidding. It's true. That's actually how he went. And then we get to Dottie. Despite her many suicide attempts, Dorothy lived to be 73. She died in 1967. Now, in between the round table, she went out to Hollywood. She did work on quite a few films. She married one of her bimbos named Alan Campbell, but he was actually quite good for her. Yeah, we have a picture of him there. He's a cutie, quite a bit younger than she was, see, 1904. They got married in 1934. They worked on a lot of movies together, and he really kept her writing. They got divorced in 1947. She had really insisted that he enlist in the army when the war broke out, and he wasn't crazy about it, but he did. But then after he came back, see, this was the same marriage for her. You get married and he goes off to war, you know. However, they remarried in 1950, and in 1963, they were living out in Hollywood, and she came home one day and found, and I'm not clear of whether she knew that there was a secret room, like behind you there, Alan, with the bookshelf that you move, and there's all of a sudden a room back there.
I keep all my money back there.
Yes. Well, Alan was in there with a plastic bag over his head and tubing. Oh. He had killed himself. And she was, of course, ran to the neighbors. Neighbor called police, whatever, and she was there. And the neighbor came up to her and said, "Dottie, I feel just terrible. Is there anything I can get you?" And she said, "Get me another husband," which to me, unfortunately, that's what I'd say. Don't worry, honey, you're not going anywhere. Let's go. Now, just two other minor things to keep in mind. She did work on Hollywood films. The two of them together worked on the original Star is Born. But she also, and they got nominated for that, I think, for an Oscar. She worked on an Alfred Hitchcock film called Saboteur. If you can find it, yeah, you might want to fast forward to get to this part. This is Robert Cummings and Priscilla Lane. It was during the war. It was about spies. It's really a crap film. But if you'll notice in the back there in the car, that's Dorothy Parker. And next to her driving the car is Alfred Hitchcock, because as you know, he always would be in his films. And in this scene where Robert Cummings is actually, he's not beating up Priscilla, and he's trying to save her from something, and he's dragging her and pulling her and whatever. And there's a close-up of Dorothy Parker where she says, "They must be terribly in love." Sums up her relationships. Also, just her last year, she wrote book reviews for Esquire, and she was still working, but she kept losing the checks. You know, she'd say, "Oh, I don't have any money," and then they'd find there were all these checks that she'd never cashed. She did have two very good friends who took very good care of her to the end of her life. You'll be thrilled to know Gloria Vanderbilt and her husband Wyatt Cooper, Anderson's dad, and the namesake for Anderson's new son, I understand. So they became good friends with Dorothy Parker. They gave her a big party and invited Jackie Kennedy, and they were really quite good to her. The one who wasn't very good to her was Lillian Hellman, the playwright. Parker made Lillian Hellman the executor of her estate. And when Parker died, Lillian Hellman just said, "Well, I don't know, what am I supposed to do?" And Parker was cremated, but her ashes were sitting in a file cabinet in her lawyer's office, which she would think was quite funny, I think. She left her estate to Martin Luther King because she was very impressed by him. And when he was assassinated, then the estate went to the NAACP. Now, just to tie this all together, on your reading list, there's a biography of Parker, which is called What Fresh Hell Is This? And it's by a woman named Marian Mead, and I highly recommend it. If you're only going to read one book on that list, I'd pick that one. It's excellent biography. And when the biography came out in the 80s, I guess, and at the ending, she said her ashes are sitting in a file cabinet. The NAACP heard about this, and they got the ashes, and they have buried her at the NAACP headquarters, and all of her royalties are going to them. And I'm sure she'll be very pleased with that. Particularly now. So good for Dottie.
Good for Dottie.
Do we want to finish off with resume?
Yeah, do. I'm going to say a few words, and then you can back to you.
Okay, this is one of Parker's most famous pieces, and it did run in FPA's column originally. The title of it is Resume, and it is: razors pain you, rivers are damp, acids stain you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns aren't lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful, you might as well live.
Brilliant.
She
Brilliant.
looks lovely there, doesn't she?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. She didn't look that good towards the end. I have to say.
She did. She was.
Well,
One of the things she did have was wonderfully piercing and penetrating eyes.
yes.
You
Beautiful.
know, and an acerbic. So I'm always very, very grateful. I never had none of it. We should all be grateful we weren't reviewed by Dorothy Parker.
Yes.
Or if we were, it would have been memorable.
Yes.
Cassidy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. It was great. Yes.
Thank you. We will see you again soon. And when I hope to see everybody next week, we'll see you in about a month or so.
Great. Thank
Goodbye.
you.
all.
Bye.